Welcome back to Compound Thesis. Our guest today is AJ Warner. He's the Chief Strategy Officer at Offchain Labs. Now, Offchain Labs is the developer behind Arbitrum, one of the largest L2 scaling solutions for Ethereum. The Compound just recently deployed on Arbitrum as part of our multi-chain strategy, which is really exciting. On the show today, we're going to dive into Ethereum's roll-up centric roadmap, the applications Arbitrum is seeing drive the most growth, and future verticals and segments to bring the next generation of users into crypto. AJ, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jim. Thanks so much for having me. Really excited for this and really excited that Compound joined the Arbitrum ecosystem.
Yeah, same here. So before we dive in to the whole roadmap for Arbitrum and the community, for those that are unfamiliar with Offchain Labs, what is your mission and what does Arbitrum solve for in the crypto ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on again. And I work at Offchain Labs, and our mission is really to help Ethereum scale. And we have two main products, and we're going to focus obviously talking about Arbitrum mainly here. But to briefly talk about, sometimes an under heralded or underrated component of the stuff that we contribute is actually Prismatic Labs software, the Prism software for staking on Ethereum layer one. So the core contributors to Prism are all, joined the Offchain Labs family, and we're really excited about all the work and contributions we make to Ethereum layer one. But Offchain Labs is obviously most famously known for building Arbitrum technology from the ground up. It's actually quite a long history of how Arbitrum got to where it is today. Ed Felton is one of the three co-founders and currently the chief scientist. When the first smart contract white papers were launched or published in, I think it was 2013 or 2014, Ed dedicated at Princeton, where he was a professor, his fall
Mhm.
2014 class to building Arbitrum, which is a layer two on top of a hypothetical layer one. Ethereum didn't even exist yet. It was just, if you're going to have smart contracts, you're going to have like a multi-tiered, multi-layered, blockchain infrastructure if you wanted to maintain decentralization, which I'm sure we're going to sort of talk about those themes, later on. Um, After that semester, you can still find the final presentation on YouTube. It's like hilarious to see sort of how far we've come. But he went to the White House where Ed was Obama's deputy CTO. When Obama, finished his term, Ed returned to Princeton, and it was the first time that you saw congestion on the Ethereum network was when the CryptoKitties NFT collection had launched. Stephen and Harry, the other two co-founders, were PhD students at the time. They approached Ed and said, we should probably pick up this Arbitrum thing again. It looks like it really will be important for scaling Ethereum, and that's sort of when they began, building, commercializing the technology. Um, 5 years later, we're here today. Obviously, it's been an exciting roadmap. Um, but the goal and mission of what we're trying to do at Offchain Labs is solve scale without compromise.
Mm.
And scale is three things. And within an environment of decentralized technology, obviously, right now we're talking about the Ethereum ecosystem. What we try to do is we try to scale throughput by increasing the amount of transactions that can be done. We try and scale fees, right? Because for inclusivity, you can't have $20 transactions or $5 transactions, even if we want to scale this technology to the world. And we're trying to scale developer experience. Um, Ethereum, obviously, the programming language is Solidity, Viper, anything that compiles to like the EVM, the Ethereum virtual machine, is not known to the world, right? Like there's, probably millions of Solidity developers in the world at this point, but there's hundreds of millions of developers in other programming languages. And we're trying to see how do we get more inclusive to onboard more developers because, the reality is not everybody's going to learn Solidity. So we're trying to see how do we get more people. We've got something called Arbitrum Stylus, which we're going to probably talk about later too. So that's really our mission is to solve scale without compromise along those three sort of, axes.
Yeah, okay, definitely. So we'll definitely dive into each one of those three verticals. But before that, it sounds like it had the foresight that there would be an L1 that lacked scalability and capacity and throughput in designing this L2. So can you do, now that we're, fast forward to 2023 and Ethereum has, been very explicit about its roll-up centric strategy. So where does Arbitrum fit into that roadmap and how does that kind of help guide your development of the Arbitrum ecosystem?
Yeah. So the reason why Ethereum has chosen this rollup centric roadmap is because there's something called the blockchain trilemma, which basically means, and the trilemma generally means there's three different things. You can only have two out of three things. In a blockchain, context, those three things are decentralization, security, and throughput.
Mm.
And principally and fundamentally, the reason for that is because if you have more throughput, it's going to become more expensive to run nodes. And if it becomes too expensive to run nodes, then nobody's going to do it on their home computers. Nobody will do it on an individual basis because they won't have incentive to do so. And you'll just have databases around the world that are run by, in server houses that are, and then we're basically not decentralized. We're back to the centralization concerns that you have in traditional technology. So Ethereum's made the choice, the decision that we want the base layer of Ethereum to remain extremely decentralized where anybody at home can run a node. And that means we have to limit the amount of capacity in the network because we want to limit the growth of the blockchain essentially, and to ensure that, hardware, retail hardware can keep up with the growth of the state. Um, so that means Ethereum has basically, like a 12 to 15 transaction per second limit. And if anything in demand in excess of that, you are going to see auctions, which makes Ethereum expensive. So how does Arbitrum and rollups typically solve this? The way they do it is by taking the execution of the transactions off of Ethereum and then posting the data to Ethereum. So if you've used Arbitrum before, or any of your users have used Arbitrum, it looks like another blockchain, right? It looks like it's no different than using, you know, Avalanche, another, EVML1 or Polygon POS, which is like a typical sidechain. But what makes Arbitrum and rollups different is it's actually a set of smart contracts that lives on top of Ethereum. And when you do a transaction on Arbitrum, the protocol takes your transaction and other transactions and it batches them together, compresses their data, and posts as a single transaction, like 1,000 transactions together to Ethereum layer one. And all of the execution happens on Arbitrum, and only your call data that is necessary to recreate your transaction on Ethereum is what's posted to Ethereum. So if Arbitrum fell over tomorrow, it didn't exist, you can recreate the entire history of the state of Arbitrum from data that's been posted to Ethereum. And this idea of taking execution off chain and posting the data and compressing it is what brings the costs from like $5 a transaction to 20 cents, because we've been able to really compress that, extremely efficiently. And, we're going to continue to improve on that. Um, so what's the secret sauce of a rollup, right? The secret sauce of a rollup, though, and this is where ZK rollups and optimistic rollups differ, is how do you prove to Ethereum that what happened on Arbitrum or a different rollup is true, correct, and complete? Right? That's the secret sauce. I can post anything I want to Ethereum, but how do I know that what was posted to Ethereum, or more importantly, how does Ethereum know what was posted to Ethereum is true, correct, and complete? And optimistic rollups, Arbitrum uses a proving mechanism where anybody can challenge what was done, and then you figure out who's correct based on history of the state. And ZK rollups will use like a ZK prover, which is like very fancy cryptography. But that's why the prover is such a critical component, because the value of doing everything off chain is only insofar as you can prove on chain that what happened is true, correct, and complete. And that's what we're really excited about with Arbitrum. Arbitrum's had its, been fully functioning and built out since about August 2021. We launched, currently, got about 65% of the market share of all Ethereum layer two rollups. And we're really excited about the growth of the ecosystem. It's both, major DeFi protocols like Compound that have joined the ecosystem from Ethereum layer one, as well as Arbitrum native projects that never could have existed on Ethereum because the gas fees would have been too high. It's been amazing to see, for example, like GMX. A lot of their growth is a function of the fact that gas fees were, much lower than they could have been ever on Ethereum layer one, where they probably, would never have been able to take off.
So in those examples, what is the delta, I guess, if they were deploying, Compound is obviously on both chains, Ethereum and Arbitrum, as well as a few others. Like, what's the delta in terms of gas fees? Like, do you have any way to quantify that? And,
Yeah, so it depends on a few things. It's not like in a perfect science. It depends, for example, on like what is Ethereum layer one's gas price right now, right? So if it's $5, like there's functions that I think, is there congestion on Arbitrum? That rarely happens, but it's possible that it could happen. But typically what we see, and it also depends on the type of transaction, right? What we typically see on like opening, closing, like a money market pool or like a DEX trade, for example, like Uniswap type trade, it's about 25 to 40 times cheaper.
mm,
Something like GMX, which is much more complicated from an execution perspective, they don't exist on layer one. but my guess would be is that it's about 100 to 150 times cheaper to do.
And so because of that, then that must, translate to the average transaction size being dramatically smaller, or at least possibly dramatically smaller on Arbitrum than it is Ethereum. So like when you talk about unlocking access to be, much more inclusive, um, you know, transaction sizes of, $1 million a buy order, or, borrowing, $10 million worth of Ethereum, it's probably something that happens every day on the L1, but on L2s, I would imagine that, because the transaction fees are much smaller, that you could actually economically still, do the same activity, but at a much smaller dollar amount. Is that true?
Yeah, so that's definitely true, right? So I think one thing that we're seeing is we're continuing to unlock access, right? Um, an Arbitrum trade, it might be about 20 cents. You know, in order to amortize the cost of a 20-cent transaction fee, if you're doing $100 trade, it's kind of, you're much more concerned about like, liquidity, you know, s- you know, um, spreads and stuff than you are with that transaction fee at that point. What
Yeah.
we're seeing though on Arbitrum is a couple of interesting things. One is that there has been a lot of movement of liquidity into Arbitrum. So for some context, there's almost 1.1 million ETH that lives in the Arbitrum bridge.
Hmm.
That means that ETH has been bridged from Ethereum to Arbitrum. Outside of like centralized exchanges and like the Lido contracts, it vastly exceeds any other existing contract or any pool, even on Ethereum layer one. So there has been a huge movement of liquidity where you could make trades of meaningful size on Arbitrum if you wanted to. Um, and on a similar note, there's about $1.2 billion of USDC that's been bridged from Ethereum to Arbitrum, right? So like, there's been meaningful and sufficient liquidity for basically any kind of trade that you'd want to do in existence at Arbitrum. It's probably not as distributed as like on Ethereum, where you have a bunch of different like major protocols with significant liquidity, but the liquidity is within the ecosystem. So what we're seeing is that there is definitely a lot of inclusion where people can do smaller trades, and we see when we track like visits to our bridge page, for example, like people are coming from developing countries much more than you'd expect,
Hmm.
especially in gaming, I would say. Um, but what you're also seeing is that it's actually both. You have people who are moving like significant liquidity. I think it's derivatives in particular, right? So like, if you want to open a position on Compound, you're probably much more likely to do so on Ethereum layer one. Just obviously there's, Compound's only been there a month, but there's not that much liquidity. But if you're talking about like a derivatives trade, that's where a lot of people are moving significant liquidity in Arbitrum. GMX is doing about $500 million a day sometimes in volume, and it's really meaningful amounts of transactions. So I think that the reason why you're still seeing people open positions on L1 is because it's a chicken and egg game, right? Ethereum, the apps, obviously the Arbitrum ecosystem, everyone wants to move to L2s, but how do you get people to do that, right? There's fragmentation because like, well, there's a lot of L2s, right? So I think that we're at a point in the market where there's some like hesitation, not so much because they don't see the future being on L2, but because, well, now I have to make a decision which L2. Now
Hmm.
might have to fragment liquidity. And I think a lot of teams and liquidity providers are sort of still getting their heads wrapped around that. And, some of it's also infrastructure, frankly. So for example, Circle announced last week that, native USDC is going to be available on Arbitrum. That's a huge thing for, I'm sure, for Compound, for example, right? When people are, deploying into Compound, they just want to, have native onboarding from US dollars into USDC and make it simple. They don't want to have to deal with any bridge risk or bridging mechanisms, etc. And, this stuff takes time to build out in an infrastructure. And, most, if not all, the infrastructure necessary is on live on Arbitrum already, but on the public Arbitrum chains at least. Um, but that's just, that's part of the chicken and egg narrative.
Yeah, no, definitely. It creates, a tailwind to the ecosystem, the more native assets are issued, versus bridged, given all the risk associated with that. And so that circle news is definitely something that our community is looking at pretty closely. And so I would imagine that a lot of the assets that have been ported over, a tremendous amount of that will convert to native USDC, but then also that'll unlock a lot more utility for folks that are concerned with bringing from one chain to another into the ecosystem. So it just will bring in a lot more activity and demand just
Sounds
natively on the platform. So can we just kind of go back to the technology side really quickly? So one thing I think we skipped over a little bit there that might be helpful to just better understand is, as Arbitrum is posting, transactions or the call data to to L1. How does that process actually take place? Like, can you describe what a sequencer is and what it does and how that is becoming more and more decentralized over time?
Yeah. So um, right now, Um, so on the Arbitrum public chains, the protocol as a whole and all the parameters have been given over to the community, right? So the ability to upgrade contracts, the ability to, in the Nova example, add data availability committee members, the ability to choose who the sequencer is, all in the control of the hands of the DAO. The sequencer itself is run more centrally, through the Arbitrum Foundation for now, and there's definitely plans to decentralize the sequencer. But the way the sequencer works, it's got a very limited role within the ecosystem. The sequencer
Mhm.
essentially can only do one thing. It can order your transaction. So it has all the transactions come in, and then it says, this is the order that I received the transactions. This is the order that the transactions are posted. It theoretically has the ability to reorder transactions to extract MEV. Right now, it's not doing so, but there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of interest in moving um, to an environment where, this stuff's getting researched, but right now it doesn't do any of that extraction.
Mhm.
Um, and that's, sort of an Offchain Labs, where I work, that's always been our philosophy to have, minimal MEV extraction from the system. But the sequencer's role is just a sequence. So it can't censor you. If the sequencer decides not to accept your transaction, you can go around the sequencer and post your transaction yourself.
Mm.
Right. So it has very limited functionality. But what the sequencer does, it takes all of these transactions and it posts them to Ethereum, basically. It compresses them into like batches. They add it to like a single batch, and that batch gets posted, to Ethereum as like representing 1,000 transactions. And that transaction that gets posted is just all the call data, right? So if you do a transaction, I do a transaction, anybody else does a transaction within a certain time frame, about like 1 to 2 minutes, it gets added as a batch of like 1,000 transactions and posted to Ethereum. And that batch, you can just recreate the entire state essentially. And if there are any validators that are watching the posting of these batches, right, and there's any assertions from validators that these batches are correct, any other validator has the ability to challenge that the batch that was posted is true, correct, and complete. Um, and they can, win the staked amount if they're right, or they'll lose the staked amount if they're wrong, essentially. So that's kind of how the system works. And the key here, I think it's pretty simple in its design, but the key and the secret sauce is, how do you have a system where you can have confidence to prove
Right.
that what actually was posted was true, correct, and complete in an efficient way? And because you have to be able to prove it over Ethereum, right? So Ethereum needs to know. It was actually really cool. So it played out in real life. It hasn't played out in real life on the public Arbitrum chains, but it played out in real life actually after the merge on the ETH POW chain.
Okay.
So what happened was, as you know, the merge happened and there was like a chain split, and ETH POW and like what we call Ethereum now, existed. So ETH POW, the bridge, was like 800,000 ETH at the time, and ETH POW is trading at like $6 a token or something. Somebody tried submitting an invalid state route to steal the 800,000 ETH POW in that bridge, which would have been worth almost $5 million for the time.
Hmm.
Someone on our team was running an ETH POW validator just because they were curious to see if somebody would try this, and actually successfully defended the chain, saying that the validator was posting invalid state route. Right. So it was cool to see quasi production, essentially,
Yeah.
that one person had the ability to defend the entire network from a malicious actor. Right. And that's like that's the properties of a roll up, that anyone who's running a validator can have the ability to defend it on Ethereum, because the system's intended to defend itself.
I mean, it sounds extremely simple, but I can imagine that, in the Princeton, PhD classes that there's quite a lot that goes into, that statement of defending the chain,
Yes,
from
definitely. Yes, it's quite complicated. We use something called interactive fraud proofs that we've been, pioneering for years. But
Right.
yes, it sounds so simple.
Yeah,
Exactly.
right. I was gonna yeah. Here I am thinking about zip files and defending a chain is the way that I think about it from a very non-technical standpoint, but I imagine that it's quite more complicated. So, to get even more technical, just, last question on that. EIP 4844, is something that I imagine is gonna impact Arbitrum. Can you explain, like, a little bit about what it is and how that's going to, impact just the
Yeah,
I guess.
definitely. I won't get too technical because I don't even understand all the technical components of it. My colleagues, parents on the prison team is actually very involved in sort of the building out of a lot of the specs and prototypes and stuff. But the way to think about it is, rollups are going to have a special highway posting data to Ethereum. So right now, the Arbitrum sequencer, the Optimism sequencer, Starknet sequencer, ZK Sync sequencer, all these different sequencers are competing for block space, for example, with a transaction that a compound user wants to do. And this makes the cost of posting call data to Ethereum more expensive
Mm.
for the sequencers. What's going to happen essentially is that the rollups are going to have a dedicated lane to post, blobs of data, essentially instead of like specific data. And these like highways are going to make posting data significantly cheaper for rollups um, than they are in the current environment. And that will presumably lead to lower fees on the L2, right? Because, we talk about 20-cent fees and, the context of Arbitrum Nova, which, I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute or two. We could go a little bit further into this, but 20 cents doesn't work for the entire world, right? There's places in the world where that's still like an absolute,
Prohibitive.
enormous amount of money, prohibitive amount of money. So we have to continue to work to lower and lower these costs. And, 4844 is going to play, a critical role in that.
Perfect. Yeah. So let's pivot over to Nova and to Arbitrum One. So, there's two different chains, optimized for different use cases, I guess. So, Arbitrum One, for those that aren't familiar, focuses really on DeFi and NFTs, while Nova is specialized more on the social and gaming side. So, can you give us a little bit of a breakdown? We heard a little bit about Compound, deploying on Arbitrum One, but what are some of the use cases you're seeing there? And then, contrast that with what you're seeing in terms of adoption on the Nova chain.
Yeah, for sure. So, um, just one point of clarification. So again, I work at Offchain Labs at the initial builders, but these two chains, Arbitrum One and Arbitrum Nova, those are what are currently in the hands of the DAO. So I'll talk about the underlying technology, and then we can talk about those ecosystems as well. So um, Arbitrum One is built on optimistic rollup technology, and that's like the core rollup technology that we've built. That's like our first initial product that we launched, the first technical product um, of rollup, and that inherits the full security of Ethereum. Right, all call data is posted to Ethereum. Obviously, there's like smart contract risk and Arbitrum. There's decentralization, there's progressive decentralization of components, but fundamentally, the rollups post the data to Ethereum. With Arbitrum Nova, which is built on what we call the AnyTrust technology, there's one additional trust assumption. And the reason we built the AnyTrust technology was because precisely what we just talked about. For certain places in the world, in certain use cases, 20 cents is still too expensive. We talked about, some third world developing countries, or even more, relevant, I would say right now is the gaming vertical, right? So some of these games where they don't have significant amount, financial activity, right? We're talking about like $1 million compound positions or opening GMX positions, right? You don't care about 20 cents there. But if I want to like, update the status of my game or, claim a skin, the skin might be worth less than 20 cents,
Right.
right? So for this to work, it needs to be significantly cheaper. But even more importantly than that, if we're talking about a non-crypto native and, user basis, particularly in gaming, a lot of the games want to abstract the cost of gaming, of transacting on the blockchain away from their users. It's much easier to model and swallow a 1 to 2 cent transaction than it is to swallow a 20 cent that has a lot of volatility depending on the price of L1. So what is the antitrust additional assumption? The assumption is that we post the validator assertions to Ethereum, but the data is actually not held on Ethereum. The data is held on a committee, on a data availability. And this committee is entrusted to hold the data on behalf of the chain. And any node can source the data from that committee if they wanted to, but Ethereum is not the host of that data; it's a committee. So, and when the really cool thing about the Nova chain is, if this committee goes malicious, any one member can turn on a switch essentially that forces the protocol into a rollup.
Hmm.
Right? So it has a backstop that, okay, we want it to be cheap, but we don't want to halt progress the same way like a sidechain might halt, right? So for example, in a typical sidechain, if there's collusion amongst the validators, the chain can stop. We
Right.
actually saw that kind of play out when Luna crashed. The validators just turned off the network essentially.
Right.
So here, the way it works in the Nova environment is you have this committee, but any one member of the committee can force the protocol into a rollup, in which case it relies on Ethereum security. So it doesn't have like a safety mechanism. But the principle is as long as one member of this committee is honest and holds your data or chooses to turn it into a rollup, you can have the committee hold the data. And this is removes the requirement to post call data to Ethereum, which is the overwhelming majority of the cost
The fees. Yeah.
of the fees of using Arbitrum, right? It's like 80 to 90%.
Wow.
Um, so with so who is this committee? So on the Arbitrum Nova, the public network right now, again, this is in the hands of the DAO. They can add or remove members however they want. But right now it's Offchain Labs, Reddit, um, Consensus, QuickNode, P2P validators, the team that was one of the initial builders of the Lido protocol, um, OpenSea. I'm probably missing someone off the top of my head, so I apologize for that. Oh, Google Cloud.
Mm.
Uh, and the reason why we sort of initially had selected this group as committee members was we tried to create a group where you can kind of have some the trust assumptions are one. There's kind of somebody in this group that regardless of who you are, you should be trusting someone, right? So if you're like a web 2 person, like, oh, I use Google Cloud, I would trust Google Cloud, right? Or
Right.
I've worked with Consensus on web 3 stuff, or, I'm using QuickNote for RPCs, or OpenSeas where I'm using my NFTs, or Reddit is, a community I tap into, or Offchain Labs, right? The team that built this, I trust them not to do this to the network, right? So the point was that everybody should feel comfortable that there is one member of this committee, at least that they would trust, that are reputable, that they have this additional security trust assumption. And, adding the committee is, fees are, if a fee is 20 cents on Arbitrum One, it's about sub penny on Arbitrum Nova.
Wow.
And Reddit was the pioneer user of the chain. So when Reddit selected Arbitrum technology for their community points program, they chose to use Nova because the scale of the program, required this. On day one, when they launched their community points program with 2 subreddits, the cryptocurrency and Fortnite subreddits, I think they airdropped the tokens to 265,000 wallets.
Wow.
If they did that on Ethereum, it would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Crazy money. Yeah.
If they did that on Arbitrum, it would have cost tens of thousands of dollars. If they did it on Arbitrum Nova, it cost less than $1,500.
Well,
So it's like it's a practical, business decision that they made with an environment that had the best trade-offs for what they need. So we push a lot of social and gaming projects to Nova. We don't push every project. Our vision, when I say Nova, I mean like the technology stack, right? So our vision is if you're a financial services product, you should be in the environment that has the best security trade-offs, right? Like money matters. The trade-offs for gaming are different. Obviously there are some assets that are very valuable within games, and we're working at interoperability so that you can list them in a more liquid environment. For example, in L1, some teams have done that, or either on Arbitrum One, which has more liquidity. But that's really how we think about it. There's not one blockchain infrastructure technology stack that works for every use case. And you should be thoughtful about what your use case is and what the trade-offs, for the way to make a decision about networks.
yeah. So I've got a ton of questions, but on the, the committee that is existing today, so that's now governed by the Arbitrum DAO. What's the process for adding and or removing members? Is that just, a standard committee vote or a community vote, or is there?
Yeah. So right now it would be a community vote. It would be, I think, a non-constitutional vote. Might be constitutional. I can't remember. That just depends on the quorum that's necessary to add people. But yeah, it's a proposal to the DAO to be added to the committee. And yeah, the DAO has the right to modify that.
To make those changes? Yeah. And is there like a term of the seats that they're holding, or is it in perpetuity until?
Right now it's set up in perpetuity. It was just like we had at Offchain Labs, we built an Nova network before the DAO had control. So we just set it up as this is the committee. The DAO there are reasons you don't want to always just be changing the committee arbitrarily, right? You want people to have the infrastructure to be building this.
Yeah.
I mean, the DAO has the right to, it's not an election process. The DAO can remove or add, depending on how they see fit.
How they see fit. Yeah. And then my last question on this particular is there uh potentially Nova 1, Nova 2, Nova 3, where you have different verticals of different committees? Like maybe there's a financial services specific one that has, big
Yeah,
bank.
yeah, exactly. That's sort of the evolution of where we see this going. So
Yeah.
we're, at Offchain Labs, part of what we're doing actually is working with projects that want to build layer three technologies. They don't want
Right.
to be on the public chains, and we're helping them, form data availability committees. We'll probably join some of these committees for them. And they're going to have their own committees. The DAO will probably have their own more additional over time public chains that
Sure.
they'll be involved with that will be, subsets, right? So one use case that you kind of reference is consortiums, right? That they want one of the advantages of these committees are you can add some layers of privacy to the data and how the data is made available. And there's definitely been some financial services folks who have been looking at that to see like how do we have a committee of a consortium that we trust to see the data. We want the validation to happen on Ethereum, but are there ways that we can shield the data from people who are not inside that committee, for example?
Yeah, I mean, disclosing who your counterparty is on every single transaction is not necessarily ideal in financial services. So,
Exactly.
uh, okay. Last question for you, which might open a little bit of a can of worms, is on the technology side. You mentioned Stylus at the beginning. So, one of the main focus areas for Arbitrum is inclusivity. And, there's a ton of different programming languages out there. You referenced Solidity, but there are a number of others. Can you talk about what Stylus is trying to achieve in terms of unlocking more adoption in Web3?
Yeah. So like I said, we've scaled, with the Arbitrum tech stack. So Arbitrum rollup and Arbitrum NHS technologies can do 7 to 10 times the capacity of an Ethereum chain. And that's again a parameter. We could probably do more, but
Yeah.
I recommend it because you want to have some decentralization of people running nodes. Um, Fees are coming down depending on if you're using one or Nova or any trusted rollup, somewhere between 50 and 200x. But developers are still struggling with the functionality of programming languages, where you right now can only use Viper or Solidity. Anything that compiles to the VM, and there are a bunch of other, blockchain ecosystems. Solana, which uses Rust, or Sui and Aptos, which use Move. That these languages that for certain use cases work well. Developers are, particularly in the Rust case, are very familiar with them.
Mhm.
And what the goal with Stylus is how do we bring additional programming language to the Ethereum ecosystem, right? So Stylus is a program that we're building, which basically allows languages that compile to WASM to be provable over Ethereum. The programming languages that we're going to start with are Rust, C, and C++. So you'll be able to build your contracts in Rust or write your contracts in Rust and deploy them to Arbitrum chains. Stylus going live on the Arbitrum public chains will have to be approved by the DAO. But in
Sure.
private Arbitrum chains that often I was in building or the technology just generally, this will be a functionality that's available, and it's extremely powerful. We've seen optimizations with precompiles that are written in Rust that can have an order of magnitude cost efficiency because there are just certain things that are cheaper to write in Rust from a resource perspective than they are to write in Solidity. They're more efficient. And those are the kind of advantages that we want developers to be able to take advantage of. And also, just, one of the things that we've been seeing is there's a trade off between, if you want to write in Rust, you have to leave the Ethereum ecosystem. So that brings a lot of people to writing in Solidity. And that friction shouldn't be necessary, right? We should be able to have more flexibility within the Ethereum ecosystem, and that's what we're trying to do. So you can have a composable Rust contract with a composable Uniswap like trade, and there's really no other ecosystem or technology stack that will be possible in. And that's very exciting. We last week announced really cool news. The prover, so that thing that I spoke about earlier, which basically, how do I know that what happens on Arbitrum is true, correct, and complete from Ethereum's perspective? Um, Prover that can prove Stylus contract that can prove Rust on Ethereum is working. We got that's been completed. So we announced that last week. There's been a ton of progress. We're still expecting Stylus to be available by the end of the year. Again, not on the public chain, that timeline's up to the DAO, but in terms of from a technology perspective being ready, we're expecting it to be ready by the end of the year, which is, really exciting. And I think, um, again, the evolution of Ethereum scaling through rollups, allows for lower fees, allows for higher throughput, but also allows for a lot more experimentation. We've seen Ethereum try and add EWASM, which is like additional programming languages, and it didn't work out. And that's fine because you want to make sure that Ethereum remains as secure, decentralized as possible for the sake of the entire ecosystem. But we're fortunate with Arbitrum technology that we're allowed to have a little bit more flexibility and experimentation.
Yeah, just expanding the surface area of contributors to the entire ecosystem, and reducing the friction of moving from one to another. So it sounds really, really powerful, and glad to hear that it's making a ton of progress.
Yeah,
Exciting news as of last week, and your timeline sounds very exciting. I know that that feels like a decade in crypto time, but end of year will happen
I
before
know,
we know.
right? Well, when you tell that to like traditional tech people, they're like, "Oh wow, that's so soon." And like, wait, why are you telling me? Come back to me in 6 months.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing for somebody that straddles kind of both TradFi and DeFi. And the just the speed and the throughput of one side versus the other is tremendously is a stark contrast.
Yep.
But it is
100%.
exciting to see those two worlds converging every single day. So well, this has been great. I appreciate you walking us through the entire ecosystem, your experience at Offchain Labs and how you guys are optimizing for the future growth of Ethereum. And, it sounds like a lot of exciting developments to come out of the Offchain team in the next few years, next few months. So, any takeaways or closing thoughts before I let you go?
Uh, yeah. Well, first of all, we're excited to see what Compound and Arbitrum can do. It's just the beginning, but it looks already really, to be really promising. Um, and I always this is kind of always my call to action to the community. When we think about the chicken and the egg of how do we have L2 and L1 interact, the scaling solutions, whether it's Offchain Labs, Arbitrum DAO, or any other roll-up builder, they cannot do without application developers and users understanding what sort of look like if you're not experimenting on these L2s, or Arbitrum, or, sort of thinking as part of your dev roadmap, like we're not going to get to a place where Ethereum becomes a service provider to rollups and, really brings the fees down for everybody. So just, I think it's a community effort. And I guess my pitch is to the community, like everybody think about the best ways they can chip in.
Yeah, absolutely. No, picks and shovels are only valuable if there's gold, and the gold is only valuable if there's a use case for it. So, it all it's all necessary from one end of the spectrum to the other. So, yeah, no, I appreciate the perspective, and Compound is excited to be a part of the Arbitrum ecosystem and continue to grow there as well. I know it's early days. So, thanks everybody for tuning in. Catch all of our episodes. We've got them on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. If you enjoyed today's show, share it with a buddy, tell your parents about it, tell your friends, and stay tuned for our next episode. Thanks again, AJ. Appreciate the
Thank
time.
you again, Harry. This was great, Jim.